The next up is excerpts from Eikonoklastes.
Eikonoklastes, the preface. To descant on the misfortunes of a person fallen from so high a dignity, who has also paid his final debt to nature and his faults, is neither of itself a thing commendable, nor the intention of this discourse. Neither was it a fond ambition or the vanity to get a name, present, or posterity by writing against a king. I never was so thirsty after fame, nor so destitute of other hopes and means, better and more certain to attain it. For kings have gained glorious titles from their favours by writing against private men, as Henry VIII did against Luther, but no man ever gained much honour by writing against a king, as not usually meeting with that force of argument in such courtly antagonists, which to convince might add to his reputation. Kings most commonly, though strong in legions, are but weak at arguments, as they who have ever accustomed from the cradle to use theirs, or only as their right hand, their reason always as their left. When unexpectedly constrained to that kind of combat, they prove but weak and puny adversaries. Nevertheless, for their sakes, who through custom, simplicity, or want of better teaching, have not more seriously considered kings than in the gaudy name of majesty, and admired them and their doings, as if they breathed not the same breath with other mortal men. I shall make no scruple to take up, for it seems to be the challenge both of him and all his party, to take up this gauntlet, though a king's, on the behalf of liberty and the Commonwealth. And further, since it appears manifestly the cunning drift of a facetious and defeated party to make the same advantage of his book, which they did before of his royal name and authority, and to intend it not so much the defence of his former actions as the promoting of their own future designs, making thereby the book their own, rather than other kings', as the benefit now must be their own more than his. Now the third time to corrupt and disorder the minds of weaker men by new suggestions and narrations, either falsely or fallaciously representing the state of things to the honour, the dishonour of this present government, and the retarding of general peace, so needful to this afflicted nation, and so nigh obtained. I suppose it no injury to the dead, but a good deed rather to the living, if by better information given, or which is enough, by only remembering them the truth of what they themselves know to be here misaffirmed, they may be kept from entering the third time unadvisedly into war and bloodshed. For as to any moment of solidity in the book itself, save only that a king is said to be the author, a name then, which there needs no more among the blockish vulgar to make it wise and excellent, and admired, nay, to set it next the Bible, though otherwise containing little else but the common grounds of tyranny and popery, dressed up the better to deceive in a new Protestant guise, and trimly garnished over, or as to any need of answering in respect of staid and well-principled men, I take it on me as a work assigned rather than by me chosen or affected, which was the cause both of beginning it so late and finishing it so leisurely in the midst of other employments and diversions. And though well it might have seemed in vain to write at all, considering the envy and almost infinite prejudice likely to be stirred up among the common sort against whatever can be written or gainsaid to be the king's book, so advantageous to a book it is, only to be a king's, and though it be an irksome labour to write with industry and judicious pains that which neither weighed nor well read shall be judged without industry or the pains of well judging, by faction and the easy literature of custom and opinion, it shall be ventured yet, and the truth not smothered, but sent abroad, in the native confidence of her single self, to earn how she can her entertainment in the world, and to find out her own readers, few perhaps, but those few of such value and substantial worth, as truth and wisdom, not respecting numbers and big names, have been ever wont in all ages to be contended with. And if the late king had thought sufficient those answers and defences made for him in his lifetime, they who on the other side accused his evil government, judging that on their behalf enough also hath been replied, the heat of this controversy was in all likelihood drawing to an end, and the further mention of his deeds, not so much unfortunate as faulty, had in tenderness to his late sufferings been willingly forborne, and perhaps for the present age might have slept with him unrepented, while his adversaries, calm and assuaged with the successes of their cause, had been the less unfavourable to his memory. But since he himself, making new appeal to truth and the world, hath left behind him this book as the best advocate and interpreter of his own actions, and his friends, by publishing, dispersing, commending, and almost adoring it, seem to place therein the chief strength and nerves of their cause, it would argue doubtless in the other party great deficiency and distrust of themselves, not to meet the force of his reason in any field whatsoever, the force and equipage of those arms they have so often met victoriously. And he who at the bar stood accepting against the form and manner of his judicature, and complained that he was not heard, neither he nor his friends shall have that cause now to find fault, being met and debated within this opinion and monumental court of his own erecting, and not only heard uttering his whole mind at large, but answered, which to do effectually, if be necessary, that to the book nothing the more respected be had for being his, they of his own party can have no just reason to exclaim. For if it were too unreasonable that he, because dead, should have the liberty in his book to speak all evil of the Parliament, and they, because living, should be expected to have less freedom, or any for them, to speak home the plain truth of a full and pertinent reply, as he, to acquit himself, hath not spared his adversaries, to load them with all sorts of blame and accusation, so to him, as in his book alive, there will be used no more courtship than he uses, but what is properly his own guilt, not imputed any more to his evil counsellors, a ceremony used longer by the Parliament than he himself desired, shall be laid here without circumlocution at his own door. That they who from the first beginning, or but now of late, by what unhappiness I know not, are so much infatuated, not with his person only, but with his palpable faults, and dote upon his deformities, may have none to blame but their own folly, if they lived and died in such a stricken blindness as next to that of Solomon had not happened to any sort of men more gross or more misleading. Yet neither let his enemies expect to find recorded here all that had been whispered in the court, or alleged openly of the king's bad actions, it being the proper scope of this work in hand, not to rip up and relate the misdoings of his whole life, but to answer only and refute the missayings of his book. But now, with a besotted and degenerate baseness of spirit, except some few who yet retain in them the old English fortitude and love of freedom, and have testified it by their matchless deeds, the rest, embastardized from the ancient noblesse of their ancestors, are ready to fall flat and give adoration to the image and memory of this man who hath offered a more cunning fetches to undermine our liberties and put tyranny into an art than any British king before him. Which low dejection and debasement of mind in the people, I must confess, I cannot willingly ascribe to the natural disposition of an Englishman. But it is evident that the chief of his adherents never loved him, never honoured either him or his cause, but as they took him to set a face upon their own malignant designs, nor bemoan his loss at all, but the loss of their own aspiring hopes. Like those captive women who the poem notes in his Iliad, to have bewailed the death of Patroclus in the outward show, but indeed their own condition. And needs must be ridiculous to any judgment unenthralled, that they who in other matters express so little fear either of God or man, should in this one particular outstrip all precisionism with their scruples and cases, and fill men's ears continuously with the noise of their conscientious loyalty and allegiance to the king. Rebels in the meanwhile to God in all their actions beside, much less that they who profess loyalty and allegiance led them to direct arms against the king's person, and thought him nothing violated by the sword of hostility drawn by them against him, should now in earnest think him violated by the unsparing sword of justice. But as to the author of these soliloquies, whether it were undoubtedly the late king, as is vulgarly believed, or any secret coadjutor, and some stick not to name him, he can add nothing, nor shall take from the weight, if any be, of reason which he brings. But allegations, not reasons, are the main contents of this book, and need no more than any other contrary allegations to lay the question before all men in an uneven balance, though it were supposed that the testimony of one man, in his own cause affirming, could be of any moment to bring in doubt the authority of a parliament denying. But if these his fair-spoken words shall be here fairly confronted and laid parallel to his own far differing deeds, manifest and visible to the whole nation, then surely we may look on them, who with notwithstanding, shall persist to give to bare words more credit than to open deeds, as men whose judgment was not rationally evinced and persuaded, but fatally stupefied and bewitched into such a blind and obstinate belief. That which the king lays down here as his first foundation, and as it were the headstone of his whole structure, that he called his last parliament, not by others' advice and the necessity of his affairs, than by his own choice and inclination, is to all-knowing men so apparently not true, it's a more unlucky and inauspicious sentence, and more betokening the downfall of his whole fabric, hardly could have come into his mind. For who knows not that the inclination of a prince is best known either by those next about him and most in favour with him, or by the current of his own actions? Those nearest to this king and most his favourites were courtiers and prelates, men whose chief study was to find out which way the king inclined and to imitate him exactly. How these men had stood affected to parliaments cannot be forgotten. No man but may remember it was their continual exercise to dispute and preach against them, and in their common discourse nothing was more frequent than that they hoped the king should now have no need of parliaments any more. And this was but the copy which his parasites had industriously taken from his own words and actions, who never called a parliament but to supply his necessities, and having supplied those, as suddenly and ignominiously dissolved it, without redressing any one grievance of the people, sometimes choosing rather to miss of his subsidies, or to raise them by illegal courses, than that the people should not still miss of their hopes to be relieved by parliaments. Much less, therefore, did he call this last parliament by his own choice and inclination, but having first tried in vain all undue ways to procure money, his army of their own accord being beaten in the north, the Lords petitioning, and the general voice of the people almost hissing him and all his ill-acted regality off the stage, compelled at length, both by his wants and by his fears, upon mere extremity he summoned this last parliament. And how is it possible that he should willingly incline to parliaments, who never was perceived to call them, but for the greedy hope of a whole national bribe, his subsidies, and never loved, never fulfilled, never promoted the true end of parliaments, the redress of grievances, but still put them off and prolonged them, whether gratified or not gratified, and was indeed the author of all those grievances? To say, therefore, that he called this parliament of his own choice and inclination argues how little truth we can expect from the sequel of this book, which ventures in the very first period to affront more than one nation with an untruth so remarkable, and presumes a more implicit faith in the people of England than the Pope ever commanded from the Romish laity, or else a natural sottishness fit to be abused and ridden. Many princes have been rigorous in laying taxes on their subjects by the head, but of any king heretofore that made a levy upon their wit, and sized as it was his own legitimate, I have not whom beside to instance. True it is, I looked rather to have found him gleaning out of the books written purposely to help devotion, and if in likelihood he have borrowed much out of prayer books than out of pastorals, then are these painted feathers that set him off so gay among the people, to be thought few or none of them his own. But if from his designs he have borrowed nothing out of the magazine and the room of their mellifluous prayers and meditations, let them for whom now mourn him, as for Tammuz, them who howl in their pulpits and by their howling declare themselves right wolves, remember and consider in the midst of their hideous faces, when they do only not cut their flesh for him like those rueful priests whom Elijah mocked, that he was once their Ahab, now their Josiah, though feigning outwardly to reverence churchmen, yet here has so extremely set at naught both them and their praying faculty, that being at loss himself what to pray in captivity, he consulted neither with the liturgy nor with the directory, but neglecting the huge fardel of all their honeycomb devotions, went directly where he doubted not to find better praying, to his mind with Pamela in the Countess Arcadia. What greater argument of disgrace and ignominy could have been thrown with cunning upon the whole clergy, than that the king, among all his priestry and all those numberless volumes of their theological distillations, not meeting with one man or book of that coat that could befriend him with the prayer in captivity, was forced to rob Sir Philip and his captive shepherdess of their heathen horizons, to supply in any fashion his miserable indigence, not of bread, of a single prayer to God. The next chapter is a penitent confession of the king and the strangest, if it be well weighed, that ever was auricular. For he repents here of giving his consent, though most unwillingly, to the most seasonable and solemn piece of justice that had been done many years in this land. But his sole conscience thought the contrary, and thus was the welfare, the safety, and within a little, unanimous demand of 3 populous nations to have attended still on the singularity of one man's opinionated conscience. If men had always been so tame and spiritless, and had not unexpectedly found the grace to understand that if his conscience was so narrow and peculiar to itself, was not fit his authority should be so ample and universal over others. For certainly a private conscience sorts not with a public calling, but declares that person rather meant by nature for a private fortune. And this also we may take for truth, that he whose conscience thinks it sin to put to death a capital offender, will as oft think it meritorious to kill a righteous person. But let us hear what the sin was that lay so sore upon him, and as one of his prayers given to Dr. Juxton testifies, to the very day of his death, it was his signing the bill of Stafford's execution, a man who all men looked upon as one of the boldest and most impetuous instruments that the king had to advance any violent or illegal design. He had ruled Ireland and some parts of England in an arbitrary manner, had endeavoured to subvert fundamental laws, to subvert parliaments, and to incense the king against them. He had also endeavoured to make hostility between England and Scotland. He had counselled the king to call over that Irish army of papists which he had cunningly raised to reduce England, as appeared by good testimony then present at the consultation, for which and many other crimes alleged and proved against him. In 28 articles he was condemned of high treason by the Parliament. The Commons, by far the greatest number, cast him. The Lords, after they had been satisfied in a full discourse by the king's solicitor and the opinions of many judges delivered in their house, agreed likewise to the sentence of treason. The people universally cried out for justice. None were his friends but courtiers and clergymen, the worst at that time and most corrupted sort of men, and court ladies, not the best of women, who when they grow to that insolence as to appear active in state affairs, are the certain sign of a dissolute, degenerate, and pusillanimous commonwealth. Last of all, the king, or rather first, for these were but his apes, was not satisfied in conscience to condemn him of high treason, and declared to both houses that no fears or respects whatsoever should make him alter that resolution founded upon his conscience. Either then his resolution was indeed not founded upon his conscience, or his conscience received better information, or else both his conscience and this his strong resolution took sail, notwithstanding these glorious words to his stronger fear.
The next is Defensio pro Populo Anglicano.
I persuade myself, Samius, that you are being vain, a flashy man, and not a little proud of being King of Great Britain's defender, who himself was styled from Defender of the Faith. For my part, I think you deserve your titles, both alike, for the King defended the faith, and you have defended him so, that betwixt you have spoiled both your causes, which I shall make appear throughout the whole ensuing discourse, and particularly in this very chapter. You told us in the 12th page your preface that so good and just a cause ought not to embellish with any flourishes of rhetoric, that the king needed no other defence than by a bare narrative of his story, and yet in your first chapter, in which you had promised us that the bare narrative, you neither tell the story right, nor do you abstain from making use of all the skill that you have in rhetoric to set it off, so that if we may take your own judgment, we believe the king's cause to be neither good nor just. But, by the way, I would advise you not to have so good an opinion of yourself, for nobody else has so of you, as to imagine that you are able to speak well upon any subject, who can neither play the part of an orator, nor a historian, nor express yourself in a style that would not be ridiculous to even in a lawyer. But like a mountebank struggler, with big swelling words of your preface, you raised our expectation, as if some mighty matter were to ensue, in which your design was not so much to introduce a true narrative of the king's story, as to make your own intended flourish go off the better. May the gods and the goddesses Damnathis bless thee with an everlasting solstice, that thou may be warm, thou can cast nor stir a foot without the sun. Perhaps you would avoid the imputation of being called Dr. Umbratius. But alas, you are in perfect darkness, that make no difference betwixt a perinatal power and a regal, that when you had called kings fathers of their country, could fancy with that metaphor that you had persuaded us that whatever is applicable to a father is so to a king. Alas, there is a great difference betwixt them. Our fathers begot us. Our kings made us, but we him. Nature has given fathers to all of us, but we ourselves appointed our own king, so that the people is not for the king, but for the king for them. We bear with a father, though he be harsh and severe, and so we do with a king. But we do not bear with a father, if he be a tyrant. If a father murder his son, himself must die for, and why should not a king be subject to the same law, which certainly is almost just one? Especially considering that a father cannot be any possibility divest himself of that relation, but a king easily may make himself neither king nor father of his people. If this action of ours be considered according to its quality, as you call it, I, who am both an Englishman born and was an eyewitness of the transactions of these times, tell you, who are both a foreigner and utter stranger to our affairs, that we have not put death a good, nor just, nor merciful, nor devout, nor godly, nor peaceable king, as you style him, but an enemy. There's been so to us almost 10 years to an end, nor one that was a father but a destroyer of this country. You confess that such things have been for yourself, have not the impudence to deny it, but not by Protestant upon Protestant king, as if he deserved the name of a Protestant, that in the letter to the Pope could give him the title of Most Holy Father, that was always more favourable to the Papists than to that of his own profession, and being such, he is not the first in his own family that has been put to death by Protestants. Chapter 2. Salmasius himself, as appeared by some writings of his own before he was bribed, was quite another mind. You aggravate the matter by telling us that it was not done in an uproar or brought about by any faction among great men, or in the heat of a rebellion. Either the people or the soldiers, there was no hatred, no fear, no ambition, no blind precipitate rashness in the case, but that it was long consulted on and done with deliberation. You did well in leaving off, being an advocate and turning a grammarian. That from accidents and circumstances of a thing, which in themselves considered sway no one way nor other, argue in dispraise of it, before you have proved the thing itself to be either good or bad. See how open you lie. If the action you are discoursing of be commendable and praiseworthy, they that did it deserve the greater honour, in that they were possessed with no passions, but did they for the virtue's sake. If there were great difficulty in the enterprise, they did well in not going about it rashly, but upon advice and consideration. For my own part, when I call with how unexpected and importunity and fervency of mind, and how ununanimous a consent, the whole army and a great part of the people from almost every county in the kingdom cried out within, one voice for justice against the king, as being the sole author of all of his calamities, I cannot but think that these things were brought about a divine impulse. Whatever the matter was, we consider the magistrates or body of the people no men ever undertook with more courage, and which our adversaries themselves confess in a more temper of mind, so brave an action that might have become famous heroes of whom we read about in the former ages, an action by which they nobled only laws, and their execution, which seem for the future equally restored to high and low against one another. But even justice itself, to have rendered it, after so signal a judgment, more illustrious and greater than its own self. We have now come to an end of the 3rd page of the 1st book, and have not the bare narrative he has promised us yet. The sects that they are public and notorious, and much more dangerous to the Church of God. Simon Magnus and Dyphus were the ringleaders of them. Yet are we so far from persecuting these men, though they are persistent enough, that for all we know them to be ill-facted to the government, and desirous of endeavouring to work a change, we allow but too much liberty. You that are both a Frenchman and a vagabond seem displeased at the English, more fierce and cruel than their own mastiffs. You are barking eloquence. Has it, have no regard to the lawful successor and heir of the crown. Take no care of the king's youngest son, nor the queen of Bohemia. Dare you affect the reputation of a learned man? I confess you are pretty well versed in phrase books and lexicons and glossaries, insomuch that you seem to have spent your time in nothing else. But you do not make appear that you have read any good authors with so much judgment as to have befitted by them. Other copies and various lections and words omitted and corruptions of texts and the like, these you are full of, but no footstep of any solid learning appears in which you have writ. Or do you think yourself a wise man, that quarrel and contend about the meanest trifles that may be? You may well allow a people that has felt heavy yoke of slavery to be wise and learned and noble enough to know what is fit to be done to a tyrant that has oppressed them. Though they neither consult with foreigners nor grammarians, but that is the man of a tyrant, not only the parliaments of England and Scotland have declared by their actions and expressed words, but almost all the people of both nations assented to it, till such time as by the tricks and artifices of the bishops they were divided into two factions. And what if it had pleased the God to choose such men, to execute his vengeance upon the greatest pontiffs on earth, as he chose to be made partakers of the benefit of the gospel? Not many wise, not many learned, not many powerful, and not many noble, that those that are not might be bring to naught those that are, and that no flesh might glory in his sight. And who are you that babble of the contrary? Dare you affect the reputation of a learned man? I confess you are pretty well versed in phrase books and lexicons and glossaries, insomuch that you seem to have spent your time in nothing else. But you do not make appear that you have read any good authors with so much judgment and benefited from them. Other copies and various lections and words omitted and corrupted texts are like these. You are full of, but no footstep of any sort of learning appears from all you have writ. Whose image and superscriptions is it, says he? They tell him that it was Caesar's. Give then to Caesar, says he, the things that Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And how come it to pass that the people should have given them the rights that are theirs? Render to all men their due, say St. Paul, Romans 13, so that Caesar may not ingress to all himself. Our liberty is not Caesar's, 'tis a blessing we have received from God himself. 'Tis that we are born to lay down at Caesar's feet, which we derive not from him, which we are not beholden to him, for we are an unworthy action, and degrading of our very nature. If one should consider attentively the countenance of a man, and inquire after those image so noble a creature were framed, would not one that heard him presently make an answer, that he was made after the image of God himself, being therefore particularly God's own, and consequently things are to be given to him. We are entirely free by nature, and cannot, without the greatest sacrilege imaginable, be reduced into a condition of slavery to any man, especially to a wicked, unjust, cruel tyrant. Our Saviour does not take upon him to determine what things are God's and what are Caesar's. He leaves that as he found it. If the piece of money which they had shrewd him was the same that was paid to God in a Vesperin's time, it was, then our Saviour is so far from having put an end to the controversy, that he has but entangled it and made it more perplexed than it ever was before. For 'tis impossible the same thing should be given to both God and to Caesar. But you say, he imitates them. What things were Caesar, to wit, the piece of money, it bore the emperor's stamp. And what of all of that? How does this advantage of your cause? You get not the emperor or yourself a penny by this conclusion. Either Christ allowed nothing at all to be Caesar's, but that piece of money that he had then in his hand, and thereby asserted to the people interest in everything else, or else, if you would have us understand him, he assigns all the money that the emperor's stamp upon it to be the emperor's own. He contradicts himself and gives the magistrates a property in every man's estate, when he himself paid the tribute money with the protestation that it was more than either praetor or himself was bound to do. The ground you rely on is very weak for money. There's the prince's image. not token of it being his, but of its good metal, and that none have presumed to counterfeit it. If the writing prints his name or settling their stamps upon a thing, vest the property of it within it. There a good way for them to invade all of property, or rather, if whatever subjects have be absolutely at the prince's disposal, which is your assertion, that piece of money was not Caesar's because his image was stamped on it, but because of right it belonged to him 'twas coined. So that nothing can be more manifest than our Saviour in this place, never intended to teach our duty to magistrates. He would have spoken more plainly if he had, but to reprehend the malice and the wickedness of the hypocritical Pharisees, when he told him that Herod laid wait to kill him, did he return to a humble, submissive answer? Go, tell that Fox says he is imitating that kings have no other right to destroy their subjects than foxes have to devour things they prey upon, say you.
But from hence you conclude that he asserted it to be the right of kings to commit murder and act injustice. You'd make an excellent moralist. But our Saviour, though he became a servant, not to make us so, but that we might be free, yet carried he himself so with relation to the magistracy as not to ascribe any more to them than their due. And therefore Saint Lupus despises thee, the master not of Saint Lupus, a holy wolf, but of some hunger-starved, thieving little wolf or other, as being more contemptible than that master of vipers, of whom Martial makes mention, who has by relation a barking she-wolf at home too, that domineers over thee most wretchedly, at whose instigations, as I am informed, thou hast wrote this stuff. And therefore, it is the less wonder that thou should endeavour to obtrude an absolute regal government upon others, who has been accustomed to bear a female rule so servilely at home thyself. Be therefore, in the name of God, the master of a wolf, lest a she-wolf be thy mistress. Be a wolf thyself, be a monster made up of a man, and a wolf whatever thou art. The English mastiffs will but make a laughing stock of thee. But I am not now at leisure to hunt for wolves, and will put an end therefore to this digression. That but a while ago wrote a book against all manner of superiority in the church, now called Saint Peter the Prince of the Apostles. How inconstant you are in your principles. But what says Peter? Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or to governors and as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of them that do well, for so is the will of God, etc. This epistle Peter wrote not only to private persons, but those strangers scattered and dispersed through Asia, who in those places where they sojourned had no other right than that the laws of hospitality entitled them to. Do you think such men's cause to be the same with that of natives, freeborn subjects, nobility, senates, assemblies of estates, and parliaments? Nay, is not the case far different of private persons, though in their own country, and senators, magistrates, without whom kings themselves cannot possibly subsist? But let us suppose that Saint Peter had directed his epistle to the natural-born subjects, and those not private persons neither. Suppose he had writ to the Senate of Rome. What then? No law that is grounded upon a reason expressly set down in the law itself obliged further than the reason of it extends. That is, according to the genuine sense and import of the word, be subordinate or legally subject. For the law, Aristotle says, is order. Submit for the Lord's sake. Why so? Because a king is an officer appointed by God for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, to wit, that we should submit and yield obedience to such as be here described. There is not a word spoken of any other. You see the ground of this precept and how well is laid. The apostle adds in the 16th verse, as free, therefore not as slaves. What now if princes pervert the design of magistracy and use the power that is put into their hands to the ruin and destruction of good men and the praise and encouragement of evildoers? Must we all be commanded to perpetual slavery, not private persons only, but our nobility, all our inferior magistrates, our very parliament itself? Is not temporal government called a human ordinance? How comes it to pass, then, that mankind should have power to appoint and constitute what may be good and profitable for one another, and want power to restrain or suppress things that are universally mischievous and destructive. In his epistles, he commands that form of government in which the law is made lord and master, and no scope given to any man to tyrannize over the laws. Aristotle is of the same opinion in his Politics, and so is Cicero in his book De Legibus, that the laws ought to govern the magistrates as they do the people. The law, therefore, having always been accounted the highest power on earth, by the judgment of the most learned and wise men that ever were, and by the constitutions of the best ordered states, and it being very certain that the doctrine of the gospel is neither contrary to reason nor the law of nations, that man is truly and properly subject to the higher powers that obeys the law, and the magistrates so far as they govern according to law. So that St. Paul does not only command the people, but princes themselves to be in subjection, who are not above the laws, but bound by them. For there is no power but of God, there is no form, no lawful constitution of any government. The most ancient laws that are known to us were formerly ascribed to God as their author. For the law, says Cicero in his Philippics, is no other than a rule of well-grounded reason derived from God himself, enjoining whatever is just and right and forbidding the contrary. So that the institution of magistracy is jure divino, and the end of it is that mankind might live under certain laws and be governed by them, but what particular form of government each nation would live under, and what persons should be entrusted with the magistracy, without doubt, was left to the choice of each nation. The apostle says, the powers that be, and you interpret his words as if he said, the powers that now be, that you may prove that the Romans ought in conscience to obey Nero, who you take for granted was an emperor. I'm very well content you should read the words so, and draw the conclusion from them. The consequence will be that Englishmen ought to yield obedience to the present government, as it is now established according to a new model, because you must needs acknowledge that it is the present government and ordained of God as much as least as Nero's was. And lest you should object that Nero came to the empire by a lawful succession, it's apparent from the Roman history that both he and Tiberius got into the chair by the tricks and artifices of their mothers and had no right at all to the succession. So that you are inconsistent with yourself and retract from your own principles in affirming that the Romans owed subjection to the government that then was, and yet denying that Englishmen owe subjection to the government that now is. But 'tis no wonder to hear you contradict yourself. There are no two things in the world more directly opposite and contrary to one another than you are to yourself. And we are as willing to appeal to the scripture as you. As for Solomon's authority, we'll consider that hereafter, when perhaps we shall better be able to understand it. First, let us hear God himself speak, Deuteronomy 17:14. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as the nations that are round about me. Which passage I could wish all men would seriously consider, for hence it appears by the testimony of God himself, first, that all nations are at liberty to erect what form of government they will amongst themselves, and to change it when and into what they will. This God affirms in express terms concerning the Hebrew nation, and it does not appear but that other nations are as to this respect in the same condition. Another remark that this place yields us is that a commonwealth is a more perfect form of government than a monarchy, and more suitable to the condition of mankind, and in the opinion of God himself, better for his own people, for himself appointed it, and could hardly be prevailed withal a great while after, and at their own importunate desire, to let him change it into a monarchy. But to make it appear that he gave them their choice to be governed by a single person or by more, so they were justly governed, in case they should in time to come resolve upon a king, he prescribes laws for this king of theirs to observe, whereby he was forbidden to multiply to himself horses and wives, or to heap up riches, whence he might easily infer that no power was put into his hands over others, but according to law, since even those actions of his life, which related only to himself, were under a law. He was commanded, therefore, to transcribe with his own hand all the precepts of the law, and having written out, to observe and keep them, that his mind might not be lifted up above his brethren. According as we hearkened unto Moses in all things, so will we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. Here's an express condition. Hear the preacher else, chapter 9, verse 17. The words of wise men are heard in quiet more than the cry of him that rules among fools. The next caution that Solomon gives us is, be not hasty to go out of his side. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doth whatsoever pleased him. That is, he does what he will to malefactors, whom the law authorizes him to punish, and against whom he may proceed with mercy or severity as he sees occasion. Here is nothing like tyranny, nothing that a good man needs be afraid of. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what dost thou? And yet we read of one that not only said to a king, what dost thou, but told him, thou hast done foolishly. But Samuel, you may say, was an extraordinary person. I answer you with your own words, which follow in the 49th page of your book. What was there extraordinary, say you, in Saul or in David? And so say I, what was there in Samuel extraordinary? He was a prophet, you'll say. So are they that now follow his example, for they act according to the will of God, either his revealed or his secret will, which you yourself grant in your 50th page. The preacher, therefore, in this place prudently advised private persons not to contend with princes, for it is even dangerous to contend with any man that's either rich or powerful. But what then? Must therefore the nobility of a nation and all the inferior magistrates and the whole body of the people not dare to mutter when a king raves and acts like a madman? Must they not oppose a foolish, wicked, outrageous tyrant that perhaps seeks the destruction of all good men? Must they not endeavor to prevent his turning? Whom all free people, if you can have the confidence hereafter to set your foot within a free country, ought to cast out from amongst them and send to some remote part of the world as a prodigy of dire portent, or to condemn to some perpetual drudgery as one devoted to slavery, solemnly obliging themselves, if they ever let you go, to undergo a worse slavery under some cruel, silly tyrant. No man living can either devise himself or borrow from any other expression so full of cruelty and contempt as may not justly be applied to you. But go on. When the Israelites asked the king of God, they said they would set up a king that should have the same rule and dominion over them that the kings of their neighbor countries exercised over their subjects. But the kings of the East, we know, had an unlimited power.
Chapter 3. Alas, there were private reasons, and infinitely inferior to the contrary party in strength and number. The now Papists will not endure a Protestant prince, nor Protestants one that is Popish. You do well and discreetly in showing yourself to be neither Papist nor Protestant, and you're very liberal in your concessions. For now you confess that all sorts of Christians agree in that very thing, that you alone take upon you with so much impudence and wickedness to cry down and oppose. And how unlike those fathers that you command, you so show yourself. They wrote apologies for the Christians to heathen princes. You defense of a wicked popish king against Christians and Protestants. Then you entertain us with a number of impertinent quotations out of Athenagoras and Tertullian, things that we have already heard out of the writings of the apostles, much more clearly and intelligibly expressed. But Tertullian was quite of a different opinion from yours, of a king's being a lord and master over his subjects, which you either knew not or wickedly dissembled. For him, though, he were a Christian, and directed his discourse to a heathen emperor, had the confidence to tell him that an emperor ought not to be called lord. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their heart. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. How ill-suited to their occasion would these expressions be, if the coming of Christ rather established and strengthened a tyrannical government and made a blind subjection the duty of all Christians. Himself, having been born, lived, and died under a tyrannical government, has thereby purchased liberty for us. And he gives us his grace to submit patiently to a condition of slavery, if there be a necessity of it. So if by any honest ways and means we can rid ourselves and obtain our liberty, he is so far from restraining us that he encouraged us to do so. Hence it is that St. Paul, not only of an evangelical but a civil liberty, says thus, "Art thou called, being a servant, care not for it, but if thou mayst be made free, use it rather. You are bought with a price, be not ye servants of men." Chapter 4. Perhaps you think, Samasius, that you have done enough to ingratiate yourself with princes, that you have deserved well of them. But if they consider their own interests and take their measures according to what it really is, not according to the false gloss that your flatteries have put upon it, there never was any man in the world that deserved so ill of them as you, none more destructive and pernicious to them and their interest in the whole world than yourself. For, by exalting the power of kings above all human laws, you tell all mankind that are subject to such a government that they are no better than slaves, and make them but the more desirous of liberty by discovering to them their error, and putting that into their heads that they never so much as dreamed of before, to wit, that they're slaves to their princes. And without doubt, such a sort of government will be more irksome and insufferable by how much the more you persuade the world, that it is not by the allowance and submission of nations that kings have obtained this exorbitant power, but that it is absolutely essential to such a form of government and of the nature of the thing itself. So that whether you make the world of your mind or no, your doctrine must needs be mischievous and destructive, and such as cannot but be abhorred of all princes. For if you should work men into a persuasion that the right of kings is without all bounds, they would no longer be subject to a kingly government. If you miss of your aim, yet you make men wary of kings by telling them that they assume such a power to themselves as of right belonging to them. But if princes will allow of those principles that I assert, if they will suffer themselves and their own power to be circumscribed by laws, instead of an uncertain, weak, and violent government, full of cares and fears, they will reign peacefully, quietly, and securely. If they slight this counsel of mine, though wholesome in itself, because of the meanness of the author, they should know that it is not my counsel only, but what was anciently advised by one of the wisest of kings. For Lysigus, king of Lacedaemon, when he observed that his own relations that were princes of Argos and Messana, by endeavoring to introduce an arbitrary government, had ruined themselves and their people. He, that he might benefit his country and secure the succession to his own family, could think upon no better expedient than to communicate his power to the Senate, and taking the great men of the realm into part of the government with himself. And by this means, the crown continued in his family for many ages. But whether it was Lysigus, or, as some learned men are of opinion, Theopompus, that introduced that mixed form of government among the Lacedaemonians, somewhat more than 100 years after Lysigus his time, of whom it is recorded that he used to boast, and by advancing the power of the Senate above that of the prince, he had settled the kingdom upon a secure foundation, and was like to leave it in a lasting and durable condition to his posterity. Which of them soever it was, I say, he has left a good example to modern princes, and was as creditable a counselor as his counsel was safe, for that all men should submit to any one man as to acknowledge a power in him superior to all humane laws. Neither did any law ever enact, nor indeed was it possible that any such law should ever be. For that cannot be said to be a law that strikes at the root of all laws and take them quite away. David, who was both a king and a prophet, would not take away Saul's life because he was God's anointed. Does it follow that because David refused to do a thing, therefore were obliged not to do that very thing? David was a private person and would not kill the king. Is that a precedent for parliament, for a whole nation? David would not revenge his own quarrel by putting his enemy to death by stealth. Does it follow that, therefore, the magistrates must not punish a malefactor according to law? He would not kill a king. Must not an assembly of the states therefore punish a tyrant? He scrupled the killing of God's anointed. Must the people therefore scruple to condemn their own anointed? Especially one that after having so long professed hostility against his own people, had washed off that anointing of his, whether sacred or civil, with the blood of his own subjects. I confess that those kings whom God by his prophets anointed to be kings were appointed to some special service, as he did Cyrus. Isa number 44. May not improperly be called the Lord's anointed, but all other princes, according to the several ways of their coming to the government, are the people's anointed, or the armies, or many times the anointed of their own faction only. But taking it for granted that all kings are God's anointed, you can never prove that therefore they're above all laws and not to be called in question. What villainous server they commit. What if David laid the charge upon himself and other private persons not to stretch forth their hands against the Lord's anointed? Does not God himself command princes not so much as to touch his anointed?
Chapter 5. To wit, lest the stronger oppress the weaker, and those persons who for their mutual safety and protection have united themselves together should be disunited and divided by injury and violence, and reduced to a bestial, savage life again. This, I suppose, is what you mean. Out of the number of those that united into one body, you say, there must needs have been the same chosen, who excelled the rest in wisdom and valour, that they either by force or by persuasion might restrain those that were refractory and keep them within due bounds. Sometimes it would so fall out that a single person whose conduct and valour was extraordinary might be able to do this, and sometimes more assisted one another with their advice and counsel. But since it's impossible that any one man should order all things himself, there was a necessity of his consulting with others, and taking some into part of the government with himself, so that whether a single person reign, or whether the supreme power reside in the body of the people, since it is impossible that all should administer the affairs of the Commonwealth, or that one man should do all, the government does always lie upon the shoulders of many. And afterwards, you say, both forms of government, whether by many or a few or by a single person, are equally according to the law of nature, for both proceed from the same principle of nature. That it is impossible for any single person so to govern alone, or not to admit others into a share of government with himself. Though I might have taken all this out of the third book of Aristotle's Politics, I choose rather to transcribe it out of your own book, for you stole it from him, as Prometheus did fire from Jupiter, to the ruin of monarchy and overthrow of yourself, in your own opinion. For inquire as diligently as you can for your life into the law of nature as you've been described it, you will not find the least footstep in it of kingly power as you explain it. The law of nature, say you, in ordering who should govern others, respected the universal good of all mankind, did not then regard the private good of any particular person, not of the prince, so that the king is for the people, and consequently the people superior to him, which being allowed, it is impossible that princes should have any right to oppress or enslave the people, that the inferior should have right to tyrannize over the superior. So that since kings cannot pretend to do any right to do mischief, the right of the people must be acknowledged according to the law of nature to be superior to that of princes, so that by the same right that before king was known, men united their strength and counsellors for the mutual safety and defence, by the same right that for the preservation of all men's liberty, peace and safety, they appointed one or more to govern the rest. By the same right, they may depose those very persons whom for their valour or wisdom they advanced to the government, or any others that were all disorderly, if they find them by reason of their slothfulness, folly, or impiety unfit for government, since nature does not regard the good of one or of a few, but of all in general. For what sort of persons were they whom you suppose to have been chosen? You say they were such as excelled in courage and conduct, to wit, such as by nature seemed fittest for government, who by reason of their excellent wisdom and valour were enabled to undertake so great a charge. The consequence of this I take to be that right of succession is not by the law of nature, that no man by the law of nature has the right to be king unless he excels all others in wisdom and courage, that all such as reign and want those qualifications are advanced to the government by force or faction, have no right by the law of nature to be what they are, but ought rather to be slaves than princes. For nature appoints that wise men should govern fools, not that wicked men should rule over good men, fools over wise men, and consequently, they that take the government out of such hands act according to the law of nature. But how should he keep others within the bounds of their duty that neglects or is ignorant of or wilfully acts contrary to his own? Allege now, if you can, any dictate of nature by which we are enjoined to neglect the wise institutions of the law of nature and have no regard to them in civil and public concerns, when we see what great and admirable things nature has self-effects in things that are inanimate and void of sense, rather than lose her end. Produce any rule of nature or natural justice by which inferior criminals ought to be punished, but kings and princes to go unpunished, and not only so, but though guilty of the greatest crimes imaginable, be had in reverence and almost adored. You agree that all forms of government, whether by many or a few or by a single person, are equally agreeable to the law of nature. So that the persons of a king is not by the law of nature more sacred than a senate of nobles or magistrates chosen from amongst the common people, who you grant may be punished and ought to be if they offend, and consequently kings ought to be so too, who are appointed to rule for the very same end and purpose that other magistrates are. The same thing you might have learned out of Dio, if your natural levity and unsettledness of judgment would have suffered you to apprehend anything that's solid. He tells us in his 53rd book of his history, out of which book you have made some quotation already, that Octavius Caesar, partly by force and partly by fraud, brought things to that pass, that the emperors of Rome became no longer fettered by laws. For him, though, he promised to the people in public that he would lay down the government and obey the laws and become subject to others, yet under pretence of making war in several provinces of the empire, still retained the legions, and so by degrees invaded the government, which he pretended he would forego. This was not regularly getting from under the law, but breaking forcibly through all laws, as Spartacus the gladiator might have done, and then assuming to himself the style of prince or emperor, as if God or the law of nature had put all men and all laws into subjugation under him. Would you inquire a little further into the original of the right of the Roman emperors? Marcus Antonius, whom Caesar, when taking up arms against the Commonwealth, he had got all the power into his hands, had made consul when a solemnity called the Luperia was celebrated at Rome, as had been contrived beforehand that he should, set a crown upon Caesar's head, that the people sighed and lamented at the sight, and caused it to be entered upon record that Marcus Antonius at the Lupercalia made Caesar king at the instance of the people. Would you know now whether the people of Rome and the provinces of the empire obeyed the Senate or maximized the emperor? Hear what the same author says. The Senate wrote letters into all the provinces requiring them to take care of their common safety and liberty. The letters were publicly read, and the friends, the deputies, the general, the tribunes, the soldiers of Maximus were slain in all places. Very few cities were found that kept their faith with the public enemy. Herodian relates the same thing. For what need we give any more instances out of the Roman histories? Let us now see what manner of things the right of kings was in those days in the nations that bordered upon the empire. Ambroid, a king of the Gauls, confession, and consequently, as well as he judged them, he might be judged by them. Vercingetorix, another king in Gaul, was accused of treason by his own people. These things Caesar relates in his history of the Gallic Wars.
Chapter 6. After having discoursed upon the law of God and of nature, and handled both so untowardly, that you have got nothing by the bargain, but a deserved reproach of ignorance and knavery, I cannot apprehend what you can have farther to alleged allegory in defence of your royal cause, but mere trifles. I, for my part, hope I have given satisfaction already to all good and learned men, and shall have done this noble cause right, Should I break off here, yet lest I should seem to any decline of your variety of arguing and integrity, rather than your immoderate and impertinence and tittle-tattle, idle follow you wherever you go, where you have a mind to go, but with such brevity as shall make it appear that after having performed whatever the necessary defence of the cause required, if not, what the dignity merited, I now do but comply with some men's expectation, if not their curiosity. Now, say you, I shall allegre other and greater arguments. What greater arguments than what the law of God and nature afforded? Help, Lucinia. The mountain Salamasus is in labour. It is not for nothing that he has gotten a she-husband. Mortals expect some extraordinary birth. If he that is called a king might be accused before any greater power, that power must be of necessity, be greater than that of the king. And if so, then must that power be indeed the kingly power, and ought to have its name of it. For a kingly power is thus defined, to wit, the supreme power in the state, residing in a single person, and which has no superior. O ridiculous birth! A mouse crept out of the mountain. Help, grammarians! One of your number is in danger of perishing. The Lord of God of nature is safe, but Salmasius his dictionary is undone. What if I should answer you thus? The words ought to give place to things that are having taken away kingly government itself. Do not think ourselves concerned about its name and definition. Let others look to that, who are in love with kings. We are contented with the enjoyment of our liberty. Such an answer would be good enough for you. But to let you see that I deal fairly with you throughout, I will answer you, not only for my own, but from the opinion of a very wise and good man, who had thought that the name and the power of the king are very consistent with a power in the people and the law, superior to that of the king himself. In the first places, Lagusius, a man who eminent for his wisdom, designing, as Plato says, to secure a kingly government, as well as it is possible, could find no better expedient to preserve it, than making the power of the Senate and of Euphori, that is, the power of the people, superior to it. Theseus and Epidurus, and king of Athens, was of the same opinion, for he is his great honour restored the people to their liberty, and advanced the power of the people above that of the king, and yet left the regal power in that city to his posterity. Whence Epicurus in his play called Suppliants introduced him on this manner. I have advanced the people themselves to the throne, having freed from the city of slavery and admitted the people to share in the government by giving them an equal right of suffrage.